August 9, 1941, Placentia Bay, Newfoundland. HMS Prince of Wales emerged from the Atlantic mist like a ghost made of steel. The brand-new British battleship, still carrying repair welds from her near-fatal encounter with the Bismarck just 10 weeks earlier, nosed through a gap in the morning fog and into a harbor that by every reasonable measure had no right to exist. Flanking her anchorage stood something that stopped Admiral Sir Dudley Pound cold. This can't be right, not here. On the rocky headland of Argentia, where fishing boats had swung at anchor since the 1600s, rose the unmistakable silhouette of a fully operational American naval base. Concrete piers stretching more than 2,000 feet into deep water. Fuel storage tanks terraced into the hillside behind them. 3 finished runways cut across what had been boggy peat meadow less than 9 months ago. A floating dry dock. Hangars large enough to shelter flying boats, barracks, workshops, a harbor whose seabed had been blasted and dredged, 803,000 cubic yards of material removed to make room for warships that drew 30 feet of water. And anchored at the center of it all, the heavy cruiser USS Augusta, flagship of the United States Atlantic Fleet, carrying a president who was officially on a fishing holiday. Prince of Wales had crossed the North Atlantic in 4.5 days, battering through heavy seas that forced her destroyer escorts to turn back before they were halfway. Churchill's staff had routed her around known U-boat patrol zones, relying on signals intelligence from Bletchley Park to thread the needle between wolf packs. They had risked a major warship and the British Prime Minister to reach this bay for a summit so sensitive that Roosevelt had not even told his own Secretary of State about it. And waiting for them was a fortress, complete, functional, and invisible to the world, that the United States had built while telling that same world it was neutral. For Admiral Pound, the sheer physical scale of what American engineers had accomplished in under 9 months on a remote Newfoundland headland rewrote every assumption he held about what was industrially possible. Britain had been fighting for its life since September 1939. Its Atlantic lifeline was being strangled by German submarines operating from newly seized French bases. The distances were punishing, the losses catastrophic, and the convoy lanes stretched across an ocean that land-based aircraft could cover only at the edges. The middle, a vast, dark stretch of mid-Atlantic where no aircraft could reach, was U-boat country. And here, in a harbor most Americans could not have located on a map, stood the answer, poured in concrete and steel, before a single American soldier had been ordered into the fight. The evidence was undeniable. Decades of doubt erased in an instant for the British. Want to know what this meant for the war? Please hit that like button and subscribe. Now, back to this incredible fortress. This is the story of Naval Station Argentia, the fortress America built to fight a war it had not entered yet. The journey to that fog-shrouded harbor had begun 11 months earlier with one of the most audacious executive maneuvers in American presidential history. By the summer of 1940, the arithmetic of the Atlantic was becoming terrifying for anyone watching closely. Germany had conquered France in 6 weeks. The French Atlantic coast, its ports at Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire, now belonged to the Third Reich, and with it came a catastrophic strategic gift. U-boats based in occupied France had hundreds of fewer nautical miles to travel before reaching the convoy lanes. Britain's Royal Navy was losing destroyers faster than its shipyards could replace them. On May 15, 1940, just 5 days after becoming Prime Minister, Winston Churchill had written directly to Franklin Roosevelt asking for the loan of 40 or 50 older American destroyers. Roosevelt had said no. Churchill kept asking. His cables grew more urgent through that summer, the language more pointed, the strategic desperation more visible. On July 31, 1940, as German bombers hammered British cities nightly, he told Roosevelt, "Mr. President, with great respect, I must tell you that in the long history of the world, this is a thing to do now." He was not wrong. British naval intelligence estimated that if the U-boat campaign continued at its current rate into 1941 without meaningful countermeasure, the tonnage losses alone could sever the supply lifeline that kept Britain armed, fed, and capable of continuing the war. Roosevelt wanted to help. The legal obstacles, however, were genuine and significant. Congress had passed legislation requiring that any military transfer could proceed only if the Chief of Naval Operations certified the equipment was not essential to American defense. 50 destroyers represented roughly one-fifth of America's destroyer force. Admiral Harold Stark was not going to sign that certification. And beyond the legal hurdle lay the political one. America's isolationist movement, organized under the America First Committee and with real congressional support, was vocal, powerful, and watching every move the administration made. The solution, assembled by Roosevelt's advisors through the summer of 1940, was elegant in its indirection. The United States would not give Britain destroyers, it would trade for them. In exchange for 50 aging World War I-era ships, specifically 3 Caldwell-class, 27 Wicks-class, and 20 Clemson-class destroyers, all laid down between 1917 and 1922, and collectively known as four-stackers for their distinctive silhouette, Britain would grant 99-year leases on 8 strategic sites across the Western Hemisphere. 2 locations, Newfoundland and Bermuda, would be gifted outright as gestures of goodwill. The remaining 6, in the Bahamas, Jamaica, Antigua, St. Lucia, Trinidad, and British Guyana, would be formally exchanged for the ships. Roosevelt bypassed Congress entirely, executing the arrangement as an executive agreement legally sanctioned by Attorney General Robert Jackson, though fiercely contested by isolationists who recognized exactly what it was, a step toward belligerency dressed as a business deal. On September 2, 1940, Secretary of State Cordell Hull and British Ambassador Lord Lothian exchanged notes in Washington. The transfer was done. Roosevelt described it publicly to Congress as an epical and far-reaching act of preparation for continental defense. That phrase was technically accurate. It was also deliberately almost entirely beside the point. The destroyers were useful. The bases, particularly the site the British had identified on Newfoundland's Avalon Peninsula, were worth incomparably more. Argentia's deep, sheltered harbor on Placentia Bay was the most significant piece of real estate in the deal. Its strategic logic was almost geometrically pure. Newfoundland's south coast jutted into the North Atlantic closer to the convoy lanes than any other point in North America. Ships sailing from Halifax and New York passed almost within sight of its cliffs on their way to Britain. The convoy routes ran directly past it. A base at Argentia would place American destroyers and patrol aircraft at the very mouth of the most dangerous stretch of ocean in the war, the approaches to the mid-Atlantic Gap, where the U-boats operated without interference from land-based air cover. No existing Allied base held that position. Within weeks of the September 2nd agreement, American naval planners had drafted construction specifications. By January 15, 1941, the first American military engineers arrived in Newfoundland aboard the troop transport USAT Edmund B. Alexander to conduct site surveys. 10 days later, on January 25th, the first American military personnel formally occupied the Argentia site. Waiting for them was a frozen headland, recently stripped of the families who had lived on it for generations. The Newfoundland government, under pressure from London and Washington, had already arranged the expulsion of more than 400 residents from the communities of Argentia and Marquise. Those families had received notice, compensation, and a timeline measured in weeks. Their displacement had been decided between governments in a matter of days, without consultation and without appeal. Construction crews from George A. Fuller Company and Merritt, Chapman, and Scott Corporation were already mobilizing on the mainland. The clock was running. With those construction crews accomplished between late January and the summer of 1941 stands as one of the most concentrated feats of wartime engineering in American history, made more remarkable by everything working against it. Argentia's weather is not merely unpleasant, it is operationally hostile in a way that distinguishes it from almost any other Allied base site in the Atlantic theater. The Avalon Peninsula sits directly in the path of North Atlantic cyclonic systems that funnel up Placentia Bay in winter, with no natural barrier to slow them. Gales measured at sustained speeds above 40 knots were routine. Temperatures routinely fell below freezing from November through April. Fog blanketed the harbor for stretches that lasted days. Workers poured concrete in conditions that required chemical admixtures to prevent the mix from freezing before it achieved structural integrity. On the airfield plateau, the ground itself was the first obstacle. The peat subsoil underlying the airfield site was waterlogged, spongy, and structurally worthless as a foundation. Before a single foot of runway could be graded, workers excavated 8.5 million cubic feet of peat and carted it away. Only then could they begin laying the compacted gravel base course that would support the weight of fully laden patrol aircraft. Every piece of equipment used in this operation, the excavators, the graders, the concrete mixers, the dredges working in the harbor, had to arrive by sea, crossing an ocean already being patrolled by the same U-boats the base was being built to fight. When onshore housing proved insufficient for the scale of the workforce required, engineers solved the problem with characteristic directness. The steamship SS Richard Peck was converted into a floating dormitory and moored in the harbor, providing bunk rooms, mess facilities, and utilities to hundreds of workers while the permanent barracks were still being framed. The ship became a construction camp that moved with the tide. In the harbor itself, the scale of civil engineering was staggering. The seaplane ramp, carved out of the shoreline to allow flying boats to taxi from water onto the apron, required dredging 520,000 cubic yards of material from the near-shore seabed. The outer anchorage required 803,000 more cubic yards cleared to create a deep-water basin capable of accommodating fleet destroyers, cruisers, and tankers. Along the waterfront, workers constructed more than 2,000 feet of concrete wharf, the deep-water pier system that would become the logistical backbone of everything that followed. By the standards of peacetime civil engineering, this was a multi-year project. The workers finished it in months. On the plateau above the harbor, 3 parallel runways took shape simultaneously, each approximately 5,000 feet long and 300 feet wide, their surfaces capable of handling aircraft up to the weight class of the PBY Catalina flying boats that would become the workhorses of Argentia's anti-submarine operations. By December 1941, 2 full PBY Catalina patrol squadrons, VP-71 and VP-72, were operating from Argentia, flying the convoy approaches and feeding intelligence on submarine positions to the escort forces below. The PBY was ideally suited to this work, with a range approaching 3,000 miles and crew stations optimized for visual search. It could sweep enormous swaths of ocean on each sortie, forcing U-boats to dive and forfeit their surface speed advantage even when no attack was possible. The Naval Operating Base was formally commissioned on July 15, 1941, roughly 6 months after the first American personnel stepped onto Newfoundland soil. The Naval Air Station on the plateau above was commissioned on August 28, 3 weeks after Roosevelt and Churchill met in the anchorage below it. Fuel was the asset that would ultimately define Argentia's operational reach. The facility's storage capacity reached 15 million gallons of fuel oil and aviation gasoline, held in tanks terraced into the hillside and invisible from the sea. An escort destroyer operating out of Halifax, where the Mid-Atlantic escort groups had a fixed operational range. Topped off at Argentia, it could steam hundreds of miles further east before needing to turn back, directly into the patrol zones where U-boats were hunting. That arithmetic of range, multiplied across the escort fleets that used Argentia as their forward fueling point throughout the Battle of the Atlantic, translated directly into convoy miles covered and submarines forced to operate defensively. The base cost the United States government more than $53 million, the single most expensive American overseas military construction project of the entire war. Every dollar was already earning its return before Pearl Harbor. On August 7, 1941, just over 3 weeks after the naval operating base was commissioned, USS Augusta steamed into the anchorage at Little Placentia Bay with a passenger who was not, according to the White House, anywhere near Newfoundland. Roosevelt's disappearance from public view had begun with a deliberate performance. Secret Service agents impersonating the president and his guests maintained the fiction of a leisure voyage aboard the presidential yacht USS Potomac as she crossed the Cape Cod Canal in view of cheering well-wishers on shore. Newspaper photographers got their pictures. Roosevelt was by then already 250 miles away, having transferred at sea from Potomac to Augusta under cover of darkness. His Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, did not know where he was. His Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, who had signed the original Destroyers for Bases notes 11 months earlier, had not been told. The operation was tighter than most combat plans. The president spent 2 days at Argentia inspecting the construction progress and fishing off Augusta's afterdeck, waiting for the British party. The scale of what his engineers had built in 9 months clearly impressed him. The piers, the fuel infrastructure, the 3 runways above, it was the concrete expression of a policy that had been fought over in Washington for more than a year, now solid and permanent in the Newfoundland fog. Then, on the morning of August 9th, Prince of Wales appeared. What followed over the next 4 days would produce the Atlantic Charter, a document that shaped the architecture of the post-war world long before the war's outcome was decided. But the physical fact of the meeting itself and the place in which it was held carried a meaning that transcended the text of any joint declaration. Churchill arrived in wartime camouflage, Prince of Wales and her escorts painted in dazzle gray and blue, the battleship's hull still marked by the temporary repairs made after her brush with Bismarck in the Denmark Strait. Augusta and her American escorts rode at anchor in peacetime light gray, their hulls unblemished by combat. The contrast in paint schemes was visible across the water of the anchorage. Churchill noticed. He was constitutionally incapable of not noticing such things. The formal meeting began when Churchill crossed to Augusta, where Roosevelt greeted him in person as a head of government for the first time. The Prime Minister had known the American president by correspondence for years. He had calibrated him carefully at long range. Now, across a mahogany table in a heavy cruiser anchored in a harbor that had been open moorland 9 months earlier, he was finally reading the man directly. On Sunday morning, August 10, the two leaders held a joint religious service on the quarterdeck of Prince of Wales. Hundreds of sailors from both navies crowded the deck in the morning light. The hymns had been personally chosen by Churchill, and they included the Navy hymn, Roosevelt's favorite. Roosevelt later told his son Elliot that if nothing else had happened during the entire conference, that single service would have been worth the journey. Over the following 2 days, the negotiations were frank to the point of productive disagreement. Churchill pressed hard for an American declaration of war, or something approaching one, a formal commitment that the United States would not permit Britain to fall. He left Argentia without it. Roosevelt was more cautious, more focused on domestic political constraints, more aware that the isolationists were watching. What the two men eventually agreed on was a vision for the world that would exist after the war, and the press release that described that vision, which the Daily Herald would later characterize as the Atlantic Charter. Its 8 principles: no territorial aggrandizement, self-determination, freedom of the seas, the abandonment of force in international relations, freedom from fear and want, became the foundational philosophy of the post-war order. The United Nations traces its lineage to Argentia, NATO's structure, the principles of collective security that governed the Cold War decades, the framework of multilateral international institutions that defined the second half of the 20th century, each carries the conceptual DNA of 4 days of talks in a fog-bound bay that had been a fishing village 18 months before. The conference concluded on the evening of August 12. Prince of Wales and Augusta exchanged formal salutes and stood out of the anchorage, their escorts forming up around them. The joint statement was publicly released in Washington and London on August 14, 1941. 4 months and 25 days later, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. The base at Argentia was already ready. To understand why Argentia mattered so decisively in the Battle of the Atlantic, it is necessary to understand the geometry of the ocean it was built to command and the specific gap in Allied capability that its location was designed to address. The North Atlantic convoy routes ran approximately 3,000 miles from North American ports to British harbors. A convoy traveled at roughly 8 knots, the speed of its slowest merchant vessel. From Halifax or New York, the crossing took weeks. And somewhere in the center of that crossing lay what Allied sailors called the Black Pit, a zone of ocean approximately 1,000 miles across at its widest, beyond the reach of land-based aircraft flying from either shore. From Newfoundland or Iceland, patrol aircraft could reach perhaps 600 to 700 miles east or west before they needed to turn back. Between those arcs lay the gap. Donitz understood this geography as precisely as any Allied planner. His wolf packs were not randomly distributed across the Atlantic. They were concentrated in the Black Pit, where convoys crossed unescorted by aircraft, where U-boats could maneuver on the surface without fear of air attack, where the killing was easiest and the cost was lowest. In October 1942 alone, 56 Allied ships totaling more than 258,000 tons were sunk in the air gap between Greenland and Iceland. The arithmetic of that slaughter was straightforward. No aircraft coverage meant freedom of action for the submarines, and freedom of action meant dead merchant seamen and sunken cargo. The weapon against submarines was air power. A patrolling aircraft, even one that never dropped a weapon, fundamentally changed the tactical equation for a U-boat commander. A submarine on the surface could make 17 knots. A U-boat forced to dive could manage perhaps 7. An aircraft that forced a submarine to dive effectively removed it from the convoy's path for hours, not minutes. Even a brief unsuccessful attack by a PBY Catalina cost the U-boat its surface speed advantage, and frequently cost it contact with the convoy entirely. Allied operational research would later document the mathematics precisely. Convoys sailing through ocean space with consistent air coverage suffered dramatically lower losses than equivalent convoys crossing the same distance without it. The problem was range, and range was a function of geography. This is why Argentia was not merely a useful addition to the Allied Atlantic posture. It was a structural intervention in the geometry of the battle itself. The base positioned American patrol aircraft and escort destroyers at the western anchor of the Black Pit approach, closer to the killing zone than any previous Allied installation on the western Atlantic shore. A PBY Catalina operating from Argentia extended American air coverage east into the convoy approaches at the precise moment when ships were transitioning from coastal safety into open ocean vulnerability. Destroyers fueled from Argentia's 15 million-gallon reserves could steam hundreds of miles further before turning back, pushing the effective escort boundary east into waters that had previously been undefended. On September 17, 1941, 6 weeks after the Atlantic Charter Conference and nearly 3 months before Pearl Harbor, this operational logic translated into direct action. 5 American destroyers departed Argentia and steamed east to rendezvous with an Atlantic convoy, escorting it across the mid-ocean approaches while the United States was still officially at peace. It was an act of war in every operational sense, dressed in the legal language of hemispheric defense. No declaration had been made, no congressional vote had been taken. The men on those destroyer bridges were doing, in practice, what American policy still publicly denied. The base had been built for exactly this purpose. Its designers had understood, as Churchill understood, as Roosevelt understood, that the Battle of the Atlantic was being decided not by individual ship-to-ship engagements, but by the cumulative mathematics of coverage, range, and response time across an ocean 3,000 miles wide. Every mile that American escort forces could push their operational boundary eastward compressed the Black Pit from the west. Every refueling stop that Argentia provided meant one more convoy that did not cross the approaches unaccompanied. This was the thesis that Argentia proved in practice before it could be stated in public, that a war can be influenced and an ocean contested by industrial investment in geography before a shot is fired in anger. The base at Argentia was not a reaction to the Battle of the Atlantic, it was a preemptive reshaping of the conditions under which that battle would be fought. The 50 destroyers exchanged for it turned out to be, as one British admiral observed with characteristic understatement, not among the finest ships ever transferred between allies. Many required extensive overhaul before they were operational. Only 30 of the 50 were in service as late as May 1941. Several were subsequently lost. The military value of those aging four-stackers was real but limited, quickly surpassed by the new destroyer production coming out of British, Canadian, and American shipyards within 18 months. But Argentia, the strategic real estate those same destroyers purchased, appreciated continuously from the moment the first American engineer drove the first survey stake into the Newfoundland peat. While the diplomatic history of Argentia centers on August 1941 and the Atlantic Charter, the operational consequences of the base stretched across the entire arc of the Atlantic War and through its most catastrophic period. The first winter after Pearl Harbor was a disaster on the Western Atlantic. With America's formal entry into the war on December 8, 1941, Admiral Ernest King pulled the majority of American naval assets toward the Pacific Theater and the Caribbean, leaving the convoy lanes off the American East Coast dangerously exposed. Donitz recognized the opportunity immediately. Operation Drumbeat, Paukenschlag, dispatched a handful of long-range Type 9 U-boats into American coastal waters in January 1942. What they found was almost unimaginable from a tactical standpoint. Merchant ships sailing independently, without convoy, often with their running lights on. Shore establishments had not yet imposed blackouts because local tourism interests had objected. At night, ships were silhouetted against the glow of American coastal cities, their outlines sharp against the light as they moved north and south along the shipping lanes. U-boat commanders later described the opening weeks of Drumbeat as a second golden opportunity, a gift from an unprepared nation. The results were catastrophic. The first U-boats reached American waters on January 13, 1942. By the time the initial wave withdrew 6 weeks later, they had sunk 156,939 tons of shipping without losing a single submarine. The larger campaign that followed consumed 397 ships, totaling more than 2 million tons over the 6 months of the full operation. By the time Admiral King finally scraped together enough ships to institute a proper convoy system along the East Coast in May 1942, nearly 5,000 Allied lives had been lost in those waters. Bathers on East Coast beaches watched ships burning on the horizon. It was the worst sustained naval disaster in American history. Argentia survived this period as a functioning forward base precisely because it had been fully operational for 6 months before the disaster began. British naval forces were already using the base's repair and refit facilities alongside American units. The Royal Navy's escort groups that transited through Argentia knew its fuel systems, its harbor layout, its approach channels. When American naval assets were stretched thin across multiple theaters simultaneously, Argentia's position on the Newfoundland coast held the western defensive anchor of the convoy approach routes. It was not a reserve asset being brought online under fire. It was a going concern that continued operating through the crisis. February 1942 brought the base its most devastating moment of another kind entirely. On the night of February 17, the Navy cargo supply ship USS Pollux departed Maine for Argentia, heavily loaded with bombs, aircraft engines, radio equipment, and stores essential to the base's operations. She was escorted by the destroyers USS Truxtun and USS Wilkes. A winter storm closed around the small convoy as it approached the Newfoundland south coast. Visibility deteriorated to near zero. Radio silence was being maintained to avoid detection. In the pre-dawn hours of February 18, before 3:30 in the morning, Truxtun struck the rocks at Chambers Cove near the tiny mining community of St. Lawrence. Pollux grounded minutes later at Lawn Point, roughly a mile and a half to the west. Wilkes also struck, but her captain drove her off the rocks under emergency power before the sea could take her. What followed tested the limits of what ordinary people can do for strangers. Truxtun carried 156 men. Pollux carried 233. The cliffs above the cove at Chambers rose 200 feet and more. Giant Atlantic swells hammered both vessels against the rocks repeatedly through the morning, breaking them apart section by section. Fuel oil poured from their ruptured tanks into the churning water between the ships and the shore, coating the men attempting to swim or struggle through the surf toward the cliff base. The water temperature was near freezing. The men who reached the cliff base found themselves trapped on ledges in the dark, oil-slicked and hypothermic, unable to climb. A dazed, oil-coated sailor from Truxtun stumbled out of the storm and into the iron ore mine shaft at St. Lawrence before 8 o'clock in the morning. The miners shut down the mine and went to the cliffs with ropes. In the fishing village of Lawn, 10 miles by road from the Pollux wreck site, 8 men set out on foot through the winter storm when word reached them. They walked the entire distance through the gale, arrived at sundown, and found survivors trapped on a ledge at the cliff base. They pulled men up by hand through the night. Their hands bled. They did not stop. Of the 389 men aboard Truxtun and Pollux, 203 died. It was the single largest accidental casualty event in U.S. Navy history to that point in the war. The bodies were brought to Argentia and buried in the base's military cemetery. The survivors of both ships owed their lives entirely to the mining families of St. Lawrence and the fishermen of Lawn, communities that had never asked for the naval base nearby, had received nothing from it, and had given everything they had when the sea brought them its dead. The United States government later acknowledged this debt with the construction of the United States Memorial Hospital in St. Lawrence, built and fully equipped by the American government and turned over to the Newfoundland government in 1953. It served the community for decades. Through the difficult middle years of 1942 and into 1943, Argentia continued its steady operational work. Aircraft patrolled the convoy approaches. Destroyers took on fuel and returned to sea. German naval prisoners, crews from submarines destroyed in the convoy lanes, began arriving at the base in late 1944. At least 2 captured German submarines were brought into the Argentia anchorage for technical inspection and servicing while under tow to American ports. In a harbor that 5 years earlier had held nothing but fishing schooners, the physical evidence of a war being won accumulated on the concrete piers. The decisive turn in the Battle of the Atlantic came in May 1943. That month, Allied forces sank 37 U-boats, losses so severe that Dönitz privately acknowledged his submarine force had been defeated in the mid-Atlantic. He withdrew the wolf packs from the convoy lanes. Allied shipping losses, which had peaked at more than 100 vessels per month between March and September 1942, fell to 4 ships in June 1943. The Black Pit had been closed from above by very long-range Liberator bombers and escort carriers, and from the sides by the cumulative pressure of bases like Argentia that had been compressing the operational space available to U-boats from the western approach since the summer of 1941. The base. Construction cost, more than $53 million, the most expensive single American overseas military construction project of the entire war. Construction timeline. First occupation, January 25, 1941. Naval Operating Base commissioned, July 15, 1941. Naval Air Station commissioned, August 28, 1941. 6 months from arrival to full operational status. Total footprint, approximately 3,392 acres, encompassing the Naval Station, the Air Station Plateau, and Fort McAndrew Army installations. Fuel storage capacity, 15 million gallons of fuel oil and aviation gasoline. The civil engineering, peat excavated for airfield foundation, 8.5 million cubic feet. Material dredged from outer harbor and anchorage, 803,000 cubic yards. Deepwater wharf constructed, more than 2,000 linear feet. Runways built, 3, each approximately 5,000 feet long and 300 feet wide. The human cost, families displaced from Argentia and Marquise, more than 400 residents. USS Truxtun and USS Pollux disaster, February 18, 1942, 203 killed of 389 men aboard, the largest single accidental U.S. Navy casualty event of the war to that date. Bodies buried in Argentia's military cemetery from the Truxtun and Pollux, the majority of those 203 men. The strategic exchange, destroyers transferred, 50, 3 Caldwell-class, 27 Wicks-class, 20 Clemson-class, all built 1917 to 1922. Of those 50, only 30 were in service as late as May 1941 due to the poor mechanical condition of vessels drawn from reserve storage. Several were subsequently lost in action. First Atlantic Convoy Escort Mission from Argentia, September 17, 1941, 5 American destroyers, United States officially neutral. PBY Catalina squadrons operating from Argentia by December 1941, 2, PV-71 and PV-72. The Battle of the Atlantic, final totals. Allied merchant ships sunk 1939 to 1945, approximately 3,500 vessels, totaling 14.5 million gross tons. Allied naval and merchant seamen killed, more than 72,000. German U-boats lost, 873 of approximately 1,162 build, approximately 67% of the entire force. German submarine crew casualties, roughly 28,000 sailors, 3 in every 5 men who served in U-boats did not survive the war. Naval Station Argentia operated until 1994. For 5 decades after the war, it served as a Cold War surveillance anchor, one of the primary nodes in the SOS-US underwater hydrophone network that tracked Soviet nuclear submarines moving through the North Atlantic. The same geographic logic that made Argentia essential in 1941 made it essential in 1959 and in 1979. The bay still opened toward Europe, the Atlantic still ran past its headland, and anything moving through those waters could be monitored from the plateau above the harbor. Soviet intelligence recognized its value correspondingly. The base was the subject of multiple documented espionage attempts between the 1940s and the 1990s, a form of confirmation, in their way, that the strategic assessment made by American planners in 1940 had been correct. When the last American personnel withdrew in 1994 and the site transferred first to Canadian federal jurisdiction, then to the Newfoundland and Labrador government, what they inherited was a 3,392-acre industrial landscape in slow transition. Most of the wartime housing was gone, demolished decades earlier, but the bones of the base remained. The concrete piers, the runway foundations, the outlines of what had been assembled in 9 months of winter construction on a headland where fishing boats had recently swung at anchor. Today, the site functions as an industrial port and commercial redevelopment zone. Divers visit the scattered wreckage of Truxtun and Pollux on the rocks of the Burin Peninsula, where the steel has been colonized by the sea for more than 80 years. The United States Memorial Hospital still serves St. Lawrence. HMS Prince of Wales, the battleship that steamed into Argentia's harbor in wartime gray on August 9, 1941, carrying a prime minister who had crossed a U-boat-patrolled ocean to meet with a president pretending to be fishing, was sunk by Japanese land-based aircraft off the Malayan coast on December 10, 1941, 4 months and 1 day after the church service on her quarterdeck. Captain John Leach, who had commanded Prince of Wales against Bismarck in the Denmark Strait and then through the fog of Placentia Bay, went down with his ship. Many of the sailors who had stood on that quarterdeck singing hymns alongside Churchill and Roosevelt were dead before the year was out. The Atlantic Charter they helped draft in that newly built harbor, the press release that became the foundational document of the post-war order, shaped the world those sailors never lived to see. The United Nations, the principles of collective security, the structures of multilateral institutions that governed the second half of the 20th century all carry the intellectual imprint of 4 days of negotiations in a harbor that had been open moorland 18 months before anyone sat down to argue about freedom of the seas. The principles demonstrated at Argentia that strategic commitment must precede formal declaration, that industrial preparation is itself a form of deterrence, that the geography of an ocean can be permanently altered by the deliberate placement of concrete and fuel, did not disappear with the scrapping of the 4 Stacker destroyers or the raising of the U-boat wrecks. They became doctrine, absorbed into the strategic culture of every major power that had watched what American engineers accomplished on a frozen Newfoundland headland in the winter of 1940 and 1941. Argentia was not a battle. No one knows the names of the foremen who drove the night shifts through the gales, or the engineers who solved the peat problem, or the dredge operators who cleared the harbor floor in the North Atlantic January cold. They left no memoirs, their names appear in no dispatches. Their work simply stood and kept standing in the fog of Placentia Bay, doing exactly what it had been designed to do for the length of one war and the length of another. The war was won, in part, by people who built things before anyone told them to.